All right, thanks for having me, guys. I have a lot of gratitude today to be invited to an event like this. Um, I mean, for a lot of reasons. And mainly, my background was in music business, and I worked in that business for decades. I had a lot of interactions with law enforcement, but they were very different back then. There's something quite different about getting an artist out of trouble versus working with law enforcement now to attempt to make the world a better place. Um, my crypto story starts in 2013 when I became an advisor to a company called Ripple. And from there, I invested in the Ethereum pre-sale in 2014 and figured a way to muddle my way through it and download a JSON wallet. And then in 2018, I formed the company with a partner, and straight out of the box, we were compliant as well as we could be with California and then with the SEC. So as I was preparing for this, I sent the deck to Monica, and she came back with some feedback in terms of how I should approach this room. One of the things she said, which she was right about, is, do you really need to be so negative? And the second thing she said was, there's more to this event than Europe and the US. And both of those things are true. And the reason I bring that up is, having ego and putting it on the shelf and being open for new solutions is a definition of learning. And I was willing to do that. So for the presentation, if it goes, thanks. I didn't really like the title of the presentation after I started thinking about it, because there wasn't compliance and there wasn't actual guidelines. And I also decided that for this conversation, I'm going to speak about America, where I live, where I work, the market I understand. I also looked at the attendance sheet, and there's only 33 Americans here. So if I say something that upsets someone, it's a pretty small list. Oops, we went backwards. That's why it wasn't working. Okay. I'll just keep. Okay. So I changed the name of the presentation from chaos to order, just to make it really simple. And, when I speak of chaos, I'm not talking about the people in this room. The people in this room do a phenomenal job. Law enforcement, track and trace, custody, storage, that's all on point. What isn't is actual asset management. And that's some of the issues I'm going to get into. Can we go to the next slide, since I don't know how to push a button? Thanks. So chaos. I looked up the definition of chaos, and I was just really kind of curious what it said. And chaos is disruption and confusion. But the way I kind of think about it, it's also a lack of structure and actually inaction. And that's what's been happening in the States a little bit. If we take a look at regulatory processes and how much inaction there's been, there's a little more now as political regimes change. But it's the first time I can remember that other markets were so significantly ahead of us. I'm going to make this thing work, I swear to God. All right, so chaos starts with confusion. And, again, in the asset management space, that's where the confusion lies. When we look at track and trace, the first track and trace companies emerged in 2013 and 14. I think Elliptic was the first one in 13. In 14, we had Chainalysis. And it was similar with custody and storage. I believe BitGo came out in about 13, but really wasn't active till 15. So those businesses are kind of established businesses at this point. They've been doing this a long time. One of the other interesting facts is, if we take a look at professionals in law enforcement and finance, less than 1% work in government positions related to cryptocurrency. And the antidote there is, if someone's taking a biological sample for law enforcement, well, they send it to a forensic scientist. And that forensic scientist, in most cases, works with an agency or something connected to government. Well, how is finance any less important? And given the fact that traditional finance companies have worked with government for a really long time, and there are models created, these assets are more complicated. So they need to have professionals inside, which I'll get to the private public components to this. Okay, so this was a little bit harsh. The US isn't in total disarray, but we've had a lot of problems. And when we think about the federal side of things, I think the first RFP with IRS, which Chain Analysis won, was in 2018. And since then, we've seen some other things happen. And with the way it works, as Aidan mentioned a little bit, the US Marshal obviously is in control of a lot of these assets. They put out RFPs. We have Treasury and TIAF that has a say, and all of the federal agencies shift their assets to the Marshal. And what we see happening is with a lot of the additional agencies, governments don't care so much about making money and generating returns as much as they care about the liability. The liability is a bigger concern if they lose money on these assets. So because of the liability, we need to figure out ways to kind of approach that. And the federal, with the Marshal Service, we did an RFP, BitGo won it, BitGo lost it, Anchorage won it, Anchorage lost it, Coinbase won it. Congratulations on case one. And, now we have this, and this is public knowledge, there's a public advocacy group that filed a suit against Coinbase. And, the question is, does that impact their relationship with the government contract? Because it's a political donation lawsuit. And my answer is, I hope not, because the industry needs companies like Coinbase that actually have approached this in an appropriate way and tried to do it the best they could when there is no regulatory guidelines to really follow. And, that is the sad point about this is we take a company, a look at a company like Coinbase, and then we have the SEC, where I was talking about non-regulation and chaos, coming after a company like Coinbase. And I think they've probably settled that by now. But that is the chaos I talk about. That's the disarray. Go to the next slide. So let's go further. I was just talking about the federal government. Let's talk about the states. I've been fortunate to meet with a lot of attorney generals, and I have been in a room many times where an attorney general, and I won't mention the state, says to me, "What is Bitcoin?" And I've been in that same room with the state police looking to the attorney general's office because there's unilateral ability to create legislation out of states by states, like countries. And the state police say, what do we do with these things? How do we deal with them? How do we dispose of them? And if the attorney general doesn't know what Bitcoin is, it's going to be kind of problematic for him to give his staff direction on how to dispose of these assets. Now, make it further complicated, we go state to state. It's bespoke. There's different levels of education in each state. You can look at a state like New York that did the bit licenses early. They're as up to speed as anyone. You can take a look at a state like Texas. They do what they want to do. They held back FTX money during that disaster. Every state is a little bit different. And then the question is, how do they interact with the federal government? Federal government takes a fee from federal seizures. The state sends it to the Marshal. The Marshal doesn't finish their RFP. There's a lot of problems. And it's not that the presentation was negative. I think it was realistic of where we're at right now. And, again, track and trace, storage, you guys got it down. You know how to trace these things. But disposing of them is something that's really important. Go ahead. Okay, so what can go wrong? Asset values. When we seize assets, we don't actually know what the life cycle values are of those assets. There's no one in this room that can tell me what the global number is for seized assets. And the reason is they're constantly changing. They're volatile. There's airdrops that we don't know about. There's forks that we don't know about. And as an asset manager, we generate a lot of reports. When we look at a liquidation, we have to make sure that there's enough liquidity, depending upon the asset we're dealing with, to be able to accomplish that liquidation. So that's one thing that can go wrong. Another thing that can go wrong is what is the legal landscape right now? As an asset manager, we have to be cognizant of the fact that if someone wants to dispose of privacy tokens, you can't do that because privacy tokens are in the United States. How do you get an exclusion? Do you go to DOJ? What's that process? To get rid of those, again, to reduce liability. And then there's nuances. We're talking about 10,000 altcoins that have value. 10,000 minimum that have different purpose, different value associated with them. So that's just really the tip of the iceberg on some of this stuff. Next slide. So safeguarding the assets, we all know how to do that, hopefully. And then we get to the pre-forfeiture stage. And preserving value is the big one. And again, that comes with reporting. What do we have? How are we going to preserve the value? And what I was going to get into a little bit, but not here necessarily, is in pre-forfeiture, we can actually generate some returns, meaning cryptocurrencies are dynamic. In the past, government has taken fiat, put it into treasury bills, and kept the interest. We can do a lot more with cryptocurrency once we get past the fear. But all of this starts with education. If there isn't a level baseline and playing field, you can't manage it if you don't understand what it is. Next one. Okay, this is the controversial slide. Sorry, Monica. So there was a liquidation that happened with Coinbase Prime, I think on June 18th or the 26th. It was about 3,800 Bitcoin. And simultaneously, Germany had about 7,900 Bitcoin. And Mt. Gox was returning some astronomical number. I thought it was 640,000 or something like that to consumers. And somehow it all hit at the same time. There was no planning about this. There was no real thought. And that's not Coinbase's fault. That's, I'm sure, what the government wanted to do. But when all those things hit together, the market dropped 16.5%. 4% was just the US. And it stayed there. So what happened as a result? I mean, our main concern is supposed to be consumer protection. How are we protecting consumers when we're tanking the market because we're not paying close attention or don't necessarily have the skill sets to be aware enough that other liquidations are happening? Not to mention, the government's, on both sides of that, lost significant dollars on that drop. The other thing that happened during that period is there was an announcement that they were going to actually do it. So that's not exactly the best way to plan for something, by announcing it, then doing it, and having the market hit, then losing the money. It's not exactly the way you want to liquidate. Next page. Thank you. All right, so BTC and ETH are the tip of the iceberg. They represent 70% of the market. It's about $2 trillion that they represent. Sorry, 70% of 2 trillion. Next slide. But the alts, they represent 30% of the market. That's $600 billion in value. So if we think this is going anywhere, it's not right now. And we're going to have a percentage of that 600 billion seized. And here's a crazy thing. I'm not talking about NFTs. Yeah, that market went away, but guess what? They still have value. In our core business, we've liquidated bankruptcies this entire year. We've liquidated, FTX and Celsius and Prime Trust, and we've liquidated billions of dollars. NFTs still have value if you understand what they are and what they mean. So with these 10,000 altcoins, it's incredibly important again to understand which ones we can liquidate and which ones we can't. Okay, so order. How do we create the order? Really simple, in a way. The first part is education. We have to create a baseline that's a standard. One of the things we've been working on is a program that's accredited I'm apprehensive to talk about it all, but it's with a university. We work with a federally recognized government agency, and we're going to create an accredited program for law enforcement and other agencies in the United States. That's the first place we start. But really, the other important thing after that is the private-public relationship. So private companies are so important because we pay attention to technology and how fast it moves and what's coming next. And as much as I love government, they can't possibly keep up with what we keep up with and what we do. But government offers something else. They offer stability and foundation. So when you put private companies together with government, you end up having something that's incredibly powerful. And again, I'm speaking about the US, but the themes are consistent. It doesn't matter. Everyone has a regulatory process you have to adhere to. Everyone has guidelines they have to follow to make sure that we do this right, because it's good for the whole industry. And this is the approach. Analysis, generating reports, understanding the life cycle of these assets, what they are. I have 1 minute. You're kidding, that fast? All right. Safeguarding and preserving, and then putting a management plan in place. I think I have one more slide. Let's go to the next one. Great partnerships. Go to the next one. I'll blow through this now. One more. I don't know why I put this slide in here, except for the fact that when we liquidate, it's incredibly important to know that there's other ways to liquidate besides just exchanges. We can go to OTC desks. The issuing protocols are really important in the altcoins. We can go back to the original issuer, and they don't want to destroy the value of the token or the value of the business. That has no market impact. These are the things we need to think about. It's the same thing with private institutions. Go ahead. Education, fill in the knowledge gap. We've covered that. Yeah, I made it to the last slide. So I wanted to get granular, but clearly I don't know 20 minutes. And the granular approach I wanted to talk about really were a couple of things. In pre-forfeiture, there are ways to generate returns. One of the things we're working on is a surety bond to cover the losses that any government may have, just another financial instrument. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is to redeploy to military operations, education, law enforcement, homelessness, whatever cause is a good cause. That's really where our head should be at this point, because we've heard so much negative about crypto. We never really hear about the positive, and it's because we're not executing on it. And the reason I say everyone does what they do really well is we just haven't got to this next part yet. And hopefully we can get to the asset management. Thank you.